There may be some implications, but not really too much. We can just pull it in and join what we want, which means it's also a better tool when you don't have a Kimball method dimensional warehouse, but you've got some extract tables and things and maybe spreadsheets, and you just want to be able to query against it. It's a lot easier to do that with this than the MDX multiple dimensional cubes. Okay, so look at the query. That's great. What about we want to do work on the individual tables? We click on this button. So these two buttons, that is our tabular model builder, editor place within Power BI. And by the way, does that mean analysis services is running as part of Power BI? Yes, it does, but not the full-blown optimized analysis services that we would get on, say, the Azure PaaS service or in SQL Server dedicated as a server. It's kind of like if you have SQLite, you can think of this as sort of analysis services light sitting on this. And it's all stored within the PBX file, and I'll take a look at that in a minute. But see, we have geography, etc. So let's say, here, I mentioned these little summation signs means that Power BI has figured out that these are numeric columns and probably facts. So it automatically says I'll aggregate those as sums. But I could say, don't do it as a sum, do it as an average, do it as the minimum, maximums, etc. But I'm going to leave those. But what I do want to do is, if I want to modify columns, I can do that. And I can right mouse click here. And you notice I can do things like create a new measure. I can edit a query behind it. I can rename the column. So I can say call it something else. What I want to do here is I'm going to say create a new column. And what you get here is this, what do you want to call the column? It's creating a little formula. All it is a variable name, column name. How do I create it? So I'm going to do something like state sales tax. And I'll say it's equal to. Now, as soon as I use the left bracket, it says, oh, I assume you're bringing in a column, so I can now look for sales amount, which for people like me who are lazy, I like to do that. And I'll just say in Massachusetts, it's about 7%, so I'm going to say that. So notice it's just a little calculation. This is called DAX, the Data Analysis Expression Language. We've got to have acronyms, right? So here I can now check it. It says, yep, it's good, and it adds this calculated column. And you can see it here. I can rename it. It's also here, sales tax, etc. And I can create many things. Now, I'm not going to get heavily into this because there's lots of things I can do. The takeaway I want from this demo for you to get is, okay, so I'm building out the underlying data source with whatever I need to do to massage it, clean it, whatever. This is where I'm building it. Lots of rich tools in here. I wish SSS were this easy because it's really nice to be able to do this. But then again, you probably wouldn't make all the money you make if it was that easy to do it, right? But in the tabular model, it is, and this is why you're going to free yourself up as a BI person, because you can do it just as easily when we talk about using Visual Studio to do the same thing. So now that we've got that, we can just go in here and say, okay, I want to do some stuff here. And I'm not a real visualization kind of person, so I'm going to drag this out a bit so I can read what I'm seeing on the right. But these are my columns, and I'm going to just use my... What did I do? State sales tax. So I'll slice out state sales tax, and I'll bring out sales amount, and then I'll go to my sales territory, and I'll just take out country, and you can see sales amounts are so tiny that the tax that you barely see it, but it's that green thing. I know, amazing visualizations. You're probably thinking we should hire Brian as a visualization person, but sorry, I'm kind of busy. And no, I'm not good at it. Not my focal point. I like building the architecture. But you can see from here that these two areas are what gave us. So we've got this that's kind of laying out the overall visualization. To be honest, I wish I had this years ago when I was designing OLTP databases, just to be able to lay out the design of this. But you can, anyway, that's there. And here you can work on your columns. And if I want to refresh, I just say refresh, and it goes through refreshing the data and does all its goodies, good stuff for me. When done, I can say save this, save as, and as a PBX, so I can say my PBI, Power BI, whatever, and just save it, and it's been saved. All right, that's it. That shows you the basics. These two boxes create our tabular model within Power BI, and that's a good baseline for us to continue and understand how does analysis services fit into this. And again, Power BI, Microsoft.com, PowerBI.Microsoft.com, desktop, just Bing it or whatever, and you can get a free download and have fun with that. And you also get, if you probably, a lot of companies have Office 365, which gives you some even additional features. You may have developer licenses and things that let you do even more cool stuff with it, which is more of a service type thing, like using the Power BI service. There's Power BI Premium. There's a lot of cool stuff. So getting back to our story, we have corporate BI, right? And corporate BI came in and said, we're going to do all this amazing stuff for the business. But as I mentioned, they got overloaded. They got too much stuff, everybody coming at them for everything and anything. And I've been in many jobs where I ended up, instead of focusing on cubes and doing deep analysis, focusing on really doing day-to-day operational kind of stuff and reconciling data, tracking down problems, figuring out what's wrong. It's not where you want to be, and it's really not adding a lot of value to the business. You don't want to get caught up. Very often you get caught up in technical debt in the space, and it's a tough thing. I share the pain for anyone who works in BI. But here's the good news. So then we got the end user BI. End user BI is when end users kind of went and said, we can't wait for you guys. Wish we could, but we're going to go off, do things in Excel, build our own stuff. But we have a problem. Now you've got a situation in which end users created things. They're going to the board of directors. They're going to senior management. They're saying, this is great. You should do X, Y, Z. You should add this product, cut this division, whatever they're saying. Where'd the data come from? How do we know it's right? What's the calculations they're using? Who approved the calculations that somebody may have used and is presenting to upper management? So what happens can happen in a case like that is senior management sees something, and then they go back to the BI group and say, hey, where did this come from? Is it right? Did you guys help with this? And it becomes kind of a conundrum for the business, because you don't want to be making key business decisions on data that may not be correct, that may not be coming from the system of record, like the claim system or something. And also, what about data governance and a lot of other things that it opens up? So here's where you hear the angels choirs come on. Enterprise self-service BI. That's where analysis services comes into the picture and helps deliver the promise of end user BI and offloads the burden that typically would put on the corporate BI. In other words, it's a balanced solution. So with analysis services, you're going to be like the person on the right. You're carefree, the beach, all good. You got lots of time. You're not stressed. You don't have an overload of work, because you've been able to very easily, quickly create these great analysis services, tabular models, and the business can click their way to happiness with all kinds of great reports and queries, and you're not burdened anymore because you're not getting calls because numbers aren't reconciling, things don't work out, people want data they can't find. I'll talk to you a little bit more about all the features that enable this. But on the left side, if you don't have analysis services, you are probably going to find yourself inundated with requests. People don't know what's what, why doesn't this agree with this, and so you can run into problems. Now I want to talk, really, we're talking about large corporations. In smaller businesses, it may not be as much of an issue, but when it gets to scale and things, that's where this kind of can become more of an issue. So the idea of analysis services is it enables the BI team to have a bigger business impact. Focus on the things they were really created for. So let's talk about the Wild West and data model proliferation. So we've got Mary here, and Mary's going along great. She decides she's going to download Power BI Desktop, and she's gone in and she's pulled some spreadsheets in she queried some stuff off of SQL Server. She's building some really robust stuff. Her boss loves it, and she's sharing this with some friends and co-workers, and it's great, going along great. So Sally decides she's going to do the same thing, and she's creating some models. What she didn't know is that Mary's created about 90% of the same stuff. She's done the same calculations and figured out what sources are good. So Sally's actually pulled in some different sources, and her numbers, her calculations, she got them from a different person. She asked somebody, and they came up with a calculation they gave her. And then, of course, Debbie does the same thing. And so now you've got three people with 90% of the same models, the same named calculations like ROI and things like that. And the problem is they're all different. So you're getting discrepancies. May not seem like a big deal with three people, but when you get too many people, it's a big deal. And this is an example of a small group. You have a large enterprise, a major corporation. You could have thousands of different users. And it's a bit of a frustration in the sense that, wow, these users are getting awesome business value. They're able to do great visualizations, reporting, and do things that were not even possible just a few years ago. So that's a great part. But we have problems with data governance, with scalability, with supportability, with validation that it's correct, all kinds of issues that we can get into. So what if we could take that tabular model and just move it up, pull it out of that Power BI desktop and put it into a server running analysis services where the BI team can create the models, edit them, Make sure they're coming from the system of record, that the calculations are right. BI departments are good. They will go to the head of sales and say, how should we calculate the sales ROI or something? They will go to legal and say, how do we calculate the risk of litigation and cost per se, whatever. So usually BI teams are really good about finding the right experts to give them the calculations, and they can get stamps of approval from upper management saying, we will bless this, that it's good, and we accept it. It's not as easy for end users to do that. They've got other things going on, and so you're going to get into problems. So that's where it really can be beneficial here. So now we can get some scale, right? We can expand the memory. Can be a server with a lot of memory, a lot of cores, all kinds of stuff going on, really powerful. And you can even scale out on-premise or in the cloud so that you have multiple machines to service requests for the same model. So you can even scale out to multiple machines. So you really have good scale. High speed. This is a fast machine. It's got the model there, and it can let you slice and dice like nobody's business. Click speed, lightning speed. Reusability is now good. Instead of that replicated model 1,000 times. And by the way, I forgot to mention the real kicker here. Imagine you have 1,000 copies of a model that are using, say, a single data source like the claim system. And they decided to drop a column out of that sales system. Or maybe they even deprecated a column that they're not using anymore. So in the case of dropping the column, they just broke 1,000 models. And suddenly that could be a critical business problem. A very critical problem in that many models are no longer working. People in the senior levels of management are saying, where's this? I need this report. I need to be able to talk to the CEO about sales. And these models are broken. They're probably going to be running back to the BI team again and saying, how do we do this? What do we do to get this up and running? It becomes a crisis because everything flows downhill, as they say in BI, and these source systems flow into BI, but BI doesn't drive them, and so usually they're often not aware of changes like columns being dropped or renamed or changed. And as I mentioned about the deprecation, that's also a critical problem because maybe you have like a promotion code, and when Mary created a model, promotion code was heavily used and it was really relevant. But they've kind of deprecated that. They've moved to something else. And if she doesn't know that, then what's going to happen is she's going to be relying and reporting information, and it might look like, wow, our promotions aren't working so well anymore. We should do something to change that. Now you've got business impact on false information. It's not reliable. And that's where the BI team can come in. They need to be aware of that, and typically they keep up to date on what's happening with the data. And hopefully most BI teams have domain experts, and they're familiar with all that stuff. And that's where the added value can come in. So you have a single source of truth. Now, a common BI thing is you'd rather have it wrong consistently than have it wrong all over the place, different inconsistencies. That's because otherwise you're going to be tracking down a million different reasons why something's wrong. Ideally, you want to have it always single source of truth and calculations that they're correct. But sometimes, as I mentioned, things can change and it will break. With the BI system, typically it's identified pretty quickly because one of these users or the BI person themselves will see it and say, oh my gosh, this looks off, it's wrong, and they can fix it one place. The other case, you again have 1,000 models and it's a problem, and it may go unnoticed. You have good data governance. You can decide who can see the data, who can get what. And you can even block columns from ever getting persisted or exposed to the Power BI users. So admittedly, you have controls on the back-end sources, but remember, you can have many different sources. And this is something overlooked, but you can now document. What are the categories of data we have? What's the proper source of Salesforce, CRM, Salesforce, Dynamics? What's the proper source for our financial data? Not only that, but when you get into it, you can say, here's the account number of the customer. Here's the name. Here's the proper field to be using for sales amount, etc. So you can really properly document what should be used where. And there's a free service called Azure Data Catalog, which you can go in and start using right off the bat and start documenting. And you can even load directly out of SQL Server to get the columns and say what they mean and how they should be used. And it can integrate even to some extent with Power BI. So it's great. Very difficult to do if you've got a million models running around with all different use cases and you don't know where things are coming from. And people leave and then there's a problem, etc. So a lot of things here that just kind of come back down to just good IT structure management. So let's go back to our story with, now we have enterprise level self-service BI, and the use case before, we can see that these people are all now using a common data model that's been blessed and approved, and we know it's solid and good and it scales well and they're going along happy, they've got what they need. And not only that, but they didn't have to go through and do all that work to create it. So they're happy. lightning response. Larger models can be supported, reusability, data governance, single source of truth, documentation, and Excel users can now connect. So another thing that people sometimes overlook is like, well, what about Excel users? There's probably more Excel users still out there, and probably will be for a while, to be honest, than there are Power BI or any other analytics users, because Excel has become the ubiquitous standard for doing your data work. It just is. It's everywhere. And now you can actually let Excel users go in, connect, and do analysis services models and pull in stuff and do a lot of good stuff there. You can also SQL Server reporting services can leverage these models. So now you don't have, if you want to build the more traditional kind of reports that aren't as visualization and interactive orientated, maybe things you deliver, you can give extracts of data, etc. SSRS, which supports scheduling and all kinds of functionality, now it can also make use of the analysis services models. And would you believe it, even Tableau can use the analysis services models. So analysis services is a good way to just provide all the benefits you see on the right, regardless of what tool you're using to get to it. Even things like ClickView, etc., can use it. How much a tool will support it depends on how much they support the standard APIs like MDX and DAX in analysis services. To the extent they do, is the extent they will benefit. So Tableau is actually pretty good with that, and so it's very cool. So let's go back to the value-added proposition here. We're talking about analysis services, security. We now have a central place we can control who gets what, when, where, how. Really important, especially in this day of HIPAA and credit card controls and GPRD governance, etc. It's becoming a major issue, so it's a big benefit. We have rich data modeling. Now the semantic layer, which is a rich fancy term that just means all that stuff I showed you. You can sort of massage your data and join it and everything else, and then you just interact with it in a very nice way, rename columns, and it's very user-friendly. That's the semantic layer people talk about. And you have those tools within analysis services. You can make sure your business logic and metrics are standardized in the right place. And under the covers, you just have a JSON file, so you can put that into source code control. So the analysis services tabular model is really just a JSON file under the covers. And you get speed of thought, or click speed, as I like to call it. As soon as you click, you get the summarization and aggregations you want. You can go into analysis services on Azure, and if you do, you can actually open what's called the web editor. So what you can now do is build your models, and I'll hopefully go into a deeper dive on that in another point. But you can actually build your models. This is in preview, so it's not GA yet. But you can actually build your models and everything as we saw in Power BI. You can do that right in the Azure portal. And you can import models directly out of Power BI projects. So that's the proof that the Power BI model is really the same thing as analysis services. What I want to focus on now is creating an analysis services project in Visual Studio. So let's take a look. I'm going to go into Visual Studio here. And Visual Studio is a much richer environment in terms of creating things. It gives you lots of different tools. It's a common environment, really depending on anything. You can do C# stuff and everything else. But a sort of templated version of Visual Studio is called SQL Server Data Tools, and that's what we're going to be really using. But it's still Visual Studio, just using some templates. So we're going to go into a new project, and we're going to go in this analysis services. I'm going to say it's a tabular project. I'm going to let it just leave that. Tabular project 3, it's fine. Go in here. And the first thing I notice, it says, what do you want to do for an instance? While we're building our models, we need to be able to test it out. We want to make sure it's working, and so we want to be able to instantiate and kind of look at it. Sometimes you do like web app development. You have to have a browser you can play with it in, so you generate a web service server in there, etc. Similar idea here. We need a way to serve the data. So we could have SQL Server Analysis Services installed locally, which I do, and I could use Analysis Services at that instance to play with it locally before I deploy it, say, to a production or a dev server somewhere else. But it's even easier to add this relatively new feature, Integrated Workspace. It just hides it under the covers and lets you work with your model and regenerate data, import data, without actually doing any deployments anywhere. And then when you're ready, you can just deploy it. So I'm going to take that setting. I have models over here. You have Solution Explorer. So it looks like projects. If you used Visual Studio before, you know there's projects and things. And I will point out too, this model BIM file, I don't have anything in there yet, so nothing to show you yet, but let me go here for a minute. And what I'm going to do here is I need to create a data source, right? I have no data here. So I'm going to say here, import data from sources. So this is like get data we saw earlier, right? Next. And I have a user-friendly name. I'm just going to say localhost. And I'm going to say log in here. I'm going to pick a database. Enterworks DW. I'm going to say next. And I'm going to say, now you have to specify another part, which is when I want to deploy, what should I have analysis services use to deploy as far as account? So I'm going to use service account. This area is a little interesting, and I hope to do a deeper dive on how you set these settings. It's kind of a weird thing to me, to be honest, because I'm used to SSAS where I just give it credentials. But here it's sort of like I'm assuming I'm in unattended mode and it's running at night, and what should analysis services use? So I'm going to use the service account. I'm going to select my data. I could write a query. I'm just going to select some tables. If I go in here, I'm going to say I want dim geography like before. I want dim sales table. Make sure I get those. And I'll say I want fact internet sales, and we'll just say finish. You can see here it's doing what happened before, right? It's loading all the data and it's preparing the model. And the first place it actually drops you into is similar to the thing that was on the right before, but we have our tables here. These are dimensions, fact tables. But I can go here and just go into my visual layout. And if you look, it really isn't that much different, right? It's the same sort of visual thing. I can still do what I did before. It's the same really tabular model we all know and love, but now it's designed to be scaled up. On the right hand side, you can see we can have multiple data sources of data. We can create things called KPI, which are key performance indicators, I think. Measures, perspectives. Perspectives I'm going to talk about, but it's a way to sort of create subgroupings within a large model so that you don't get confused. Users don't get confused by things. You can create sort of an accounting focus and a sales focus. You have your relationships here. You can create as many as you want. And here's where you can actually add security roles, and you've got all your tables, all that good stuff. You have something also for translation. So if you have multiple, you need multilingual support. You've got people in Europe and other places. You can build that in. So it's very robust this way. And similar to before, we can go in here and we can do things right off the columns. We can drop down here. We can right mouse click. It's very similar to what we had. And if we want to hide something, so this is really cool. You know, maybe I want to go in here and I say, you know, maybe a promotion key is something that is top secret. Maybe it's social security number. I can just say hide from client tools, and I blocked it. Nobody will be able to see that from Power BI. So that's really good for any kind of PII, HIPAA compliance, credit card information. Personally, I would ideally recommend to customers a best practice. Anything you're building off of from the tabular model or from Power BI should be based on SQL views if you're using SQL Server, and then you can control what they get. And if you don't need to bring in any kind of security information like PII, leave it behind. You can protect it. I'm not saying you can't, but I like the idea of parsimony in terms of security. Don't put things in places they're not needed. So that's my recommendation there. And you can go in here and, for instance, I can create functions of measures, but you get all this stuff. It's the same idea as what you saw before. And I can go into Excel once I've saved this. So let me just check my data source again. Use Windows. I'm going to change this to use an account. I find that when you actually go to deploy, it works better when you use actual accounts. Okay. So no biggie there. If I wanted to refresh, I can say model process all, and then that should go through and process my model, and it loaded it. But I still am working. All that is done locally. Remember we talked about the integrated workspace. When I want to move the model somewhere, I can go here, and I can say, go to build and say deploy. And now it's actually physically pushing this out to my server. It's successful, thank goodness. So I'm good, and I can go here and now let's take a look at it. So I'm connected. This is analysis services here, so I'm in my database, and I'm gonna refresh it, and you see I think it's 6. Let's see. No, it's Tabular Project 3. A lot of useless names here, but you can see in here too. I've got my columns, etc., and I can get a look at my connections. So all these objects are visible in here. And one of the things I find really cool is that I can actually connect to analysis services in Azure and use SSMS to connect to it too. Most of the things within analysis services like Azure SQL DB, things like that. You can actually use SQL Server Management Studio locally and connect as if they were local. So that I really like that because SQL Server Management Studio is awesome. All right, so I've shown you now how the Visual Studio is used to create a tabular model. I've shown you what I just did is as complicated as that. Build, deploy. Users are very often surprised. It's like, that's all there is to deploy? Yeah. I used to do that in Cube. It ran for 3 hours, calculating every possible combination of summaries. I'm like, I know, it doesn't do that anymore. It's just persisting a table. It's like a view, as I said. So you get a lot of cool stuff in here, and all kinds of options you can configure things through. So let's go back to where we were. So another slant on this is the ability to sleep well. If you don't like the idea that things are going on out there, you don't know who's using what data, how are they using it, and the business could be in trouble, you can also look at this as it's the ability to sleep well. A single source of truth. Reusability and supportability, and that's because of the common models, measures, calculations, KPIs, yada, yada, yada. Accessibility, what I really mean by that is the part where I talked about Excel being able to get at, Tableau being able to get at, SSRS, as well as the Power BI users and anybody else who can communicate to analysis services. That's centralized access. You have governance and security, scale and click speed response, and that's not trivial because everybody wants everything instantly now. When you're talking about data, that's not an easy thing to deliver. Now I'm going to talk about a few key features of analysis services that I call value added, that are really important, and I added them here just because I don't want to leave them off, because it's like you might be saying, well, yeah, it's okay, but what else do I get out of it? So I wanted to kind of cover that. What else am I getting here? Do I really want to buy the Porsche? One is partitions. So if you've used SQL Server, and I relate it back to people, I think a lot of people I usually talk to are SQL Server, maybe DBAs or something, so I try to talk back to what people can relate to. But what partitions do is, if you use partitioning in SQL Server, it actually takes up a really large table and breaks it into chunks, and you set up a rule by which it will determine, how it does that. Often it's by date, like maybe each year of sales data will go on a different partition, so it physically is separating it. Now, it's not an easy thing to do that on tables, but it is a piece of cake in the tabular model. It's just setting up a rule. So I just wanted to mention you can do that. So if you have a lot of data you need to load, maybe you're loading 3 or 4 years of sales history, you can just say, okay, we know the sales history beyond this year is over, and we're only going to refresh maybe year to date. Or maybe even we know monthly. We can just start picking up on each month. That can be automated. I'll mention that a little bit later on, but you can do that with like PowerShell and things to automate things. So partitions is a really handy way to scale up maintenance. You don't have to refresh everything. And remember too, analysis services is handling the refreshing for you so that you don't have people sitting there waiting for data to refresh. Now the languages support, you get DAX. That's the most important language. You do not need to know these languages. You will want them only when you get stuck, okay? I love the idea of extensibility. I like the idea of having languages and things that I can do. SSAS, for instance, I can do C# in there if I need to. I don't like to all the time. I won't do that because I'm lazy. I don't want to do it unless I have to, but I love the ability to, because sometimes you get caught in a corner and you're going to need to do things. DAX is kind of your go-to language. It's really pretty straightforward. Design line references and things, and I'm going to call to attention to more of that later. DAX is probably the only language in here you're really going to want to know, and I would argue PowerShell for the automation end. I love PowerShell, so I'm biased, but those are the two that I'd say are the only ones that are really necessary. MDX is kind of really the multidimensional expression language, but it is supported by the tabular model, so it can be used, but I don't think you need to. M is actually, I believe it's underneath. It's the Power View language, Power View, Power Query language. Why we call it M, I don't know. But it allows you to do some other types of stuff in a scripting language. TMSL is the tabular model scripting language. And that's useful for doing things like, if you want, you can use it to do things like refresh a partition or a data model to get the data reloaded, etc. But you can also use it in combination with PowerShell to do things. And then the analysis management objects / tabular object model. That's another one you got. So you get a lot of little languages. Everything is yet another language, YAL, right? So you get yet another language. But the takeaway is it's going to give you some power and flexibility. Don't look at it as things you have to learn, because you really don't. Just look at it as tools you can use if you need them. Models are text. So, and I meant to show you that, so let me back up for one moment. I kind of forgot that. But let me go to the Solution Explorer. and say view code. And it's going to tell me you're going to have to close this. And I'm saying, okay, but it's worth it. See this? All this code? that is, I just messed up my code. Don't do that at home. But basically, that is the tabular model right there. That's the code behind it. And you can, there's an enhanced editor, I think online in the analysis surface in Azure, but you can also install it here where you get more IntelliSense around this and you can edit it directly if you want. But it's just text, so you can put it into GitHub or whatever you like. Roles can be created so you can secure things. You can add things within analysis surface saying what groups can use things and enroll people in groups and stuff. So again, you get that security layer that's much harder to get within Power BI directly. And I mentioned direct query. Analysis Services does support direct query. You can set things up to pass things through and use direct query, but it's not what I would say is a go-to-compare tool. So kind of a nice thing is if you have, tabular model, you've made one's in production, one's one that you're making changes to, and you want to compare them and maybe pick off parts of it that you'd like to extract and deploy alone, you can do that. So it's a nice feature. We've covered a lot. Thank you for bearing with me. If you're still with me, we're wrapping up soon. Just call it closing out. So what is a tabular model? We've talked about that. Basically, it's an in-memory table, highly compressed, and it lowest level of detail that you can just slice and dice with. Why analysis services? I hope I've driven the point home about how awesome analysis services is. I'm a big believer in it. It allows you to scale, it allows you greater management, it allows you to get all the benefits, I believe, of Power BI and self-service BI without the drawbacks that are potential of the sort of Wild West replication of models. I will put a caveat on that, though. I don't believe it's good to just, kind of try to clamp down on everyone doing anything without the analysis services piece. I think it's okay. You just want to make sure that if something's really got a big impact on the business and used by a lot of people, that's the places, the opportunities where you want to take those mission critical data platforms and use analysis services for those. We've talked about what is analysis services. I hope I've explained it well, and it's that scaled up sort of server based thing. Looked a lot at features and benefits, and we looked at the tools, which is like Power BI and mainly SSDT, SQL Server Data Tools, which is Visual Studio. And that's the gist of it. So please subscribe. Remember the book at the beginning, really good book. If you're not sure what it is, you can go to my GitHub account already here, bcaffe/shared under analysis services, and you can get a reference to that book. I really like it. There's online classes and things you can look at. There's really good documentation online. Just bing around and you'll see tutorials, etc. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and share this with your friends. There's a lot of people out there that need this stuff. As I mentioned, I'm going to be doing a series, so this is just the beginning of a great amount of information, hopefully. Thank you.